Oh yeah. And there. Yeah, that should do it for now. And with that, I think I've earned myself some downtime. And I know just how to spend it. So, in case you didn't catch that Steam window, I play MMOs quite a bit. Don't get me wrong, I know that I'm far from the highest hour count on this game, but it's still a decently sized number. In all those hours of Final Fantasy XIV, I've come to have a lot of opinions about it. I'm not going to spout all of them today, since I'm not quite ready to be dragged out into the streets by rabid fans, but I do want to take a little time to compare those opinions to my opinions of another MMO. I mean, the obvious comparison of World of Warcraft, of course. See, I have a decent amount of time in WoW as well, and it's been the source of my absolute brain rot over the past few weeks since my fiancé and a good friend of ours dragged me back in due to new expansion hype. Thanks guys, love you both. There's a lot to talk about regarding these two games and their comparisons, and it's probably all been said before, but not by me, and I like giving my useless and unasked for opinions to anyone who will listen, so let's do this, yeah? Let's start with the obvious, since Final Fantasy XIV clearly draws a lot of inspiration from World of Warcraft. They're both high fantasy MMORPGs deeply rooted in their universe's story that operate on a global cooldown system that sees the main character traversing the world and experiencing its stories via quests, dungeons, raids, and more, all facilitated by parties consisting of tanks, healers, and DPS classes. The comparisons pretty much stop there though. Despite what you'll hear about WoW clones, and trust me, they do exist, Final Fantasy XIV really just borrowed the base systems and tweaked it for its own use, and if anyone spent enough time in both games, like maybe 5 hours, you'd see that pretty quick. The design philosophy for the two games is very different. Final Fantasy XIV has a long history, dating back to a game that doesn't even exist anymore, one that much more closely resembled its grandfather title of Final Fantasy XI rather than the Final Fantasy XIV we know today. You know the meme. But we can talk about the history of this game in the far-off future. For now, I just want to take a look at what we have nowadays. If we just look at the latest expansion, Endwalker, we can see that we have 6 zones to traverse for the story that culminates in the saving of the universe yet again, and is followed up with the post-patch story that sees us saving the universe yet again. How many times does this make? This journey takes us from level 80 to 90, and the beautiful thing about that is it doesn't matter what class you do it on. You can change whenever the hell you want. Sick of being a paladin? Pick up the blade. Magic got you feeling sour? Pick up the blade. Healing not really tickling your fancy? Pick up the blade. On the other hand, we have World of Warcraft's Dragonflight. We'll once again be traveling through a series of zones, 7 to be exact, and leveling from 60 to 70 while indulging in the expansion's story and gimmicks. We find ourselves rushing to stop the threat of the Primalists, a cult of peoples worshipping the newly freed incarnates who want to overthrow the Dragonflights and return Azeroth to its natural order. Unlike Final Fantasy XIV, your decision of class will be a sticking one. If you choose to start as a mage, you will be a mage until the day you stop playing. This isn't too limiting, however, as every class has 3 or so specializations that can change up their playstyle, but it does mean that you need to make a new character to play another class. Thankfully, Blizzard cuts us a little slack, as many things do carry over from character to character. The main gimmick of dragon riding comes to mind, as the glyphs you collect for dragon riding upgrades on one character can be used by any character on your account to help accelerate future characters. With these basic overviews out of the way though, let's go ahead and dive right into the real meat and potatoes of these games. And what better place to start with than what was once the meat of an MMO, and what now feels like an afterthought slapped in to keep you looking at pretty scenery, the overworld. This is probably where I'll be the harshest on both games, since it feels like the game design of each of them is now designed to minimize the amount of time spent in the overworld, and to keep players hurtling through dungeons, raids, and other instanced content. I will give each game some credit before we separate them, however. Both of them have absolutely beautiful overworlds this expansion, each with well-varied environments and plenty of lore and story behind them. But beyond the visual and story aesthetics, how does the content hold up? Final Fantasy XIV's overworld is jam-packed with quite a bit to do, but the main question is how much of it is enjoyable, or at the very least, worth doing. The first place we'll start is with the story. Final Fantasy XIV's story is mandatory, meaning that as you progress through the game, you'll be doing all these quests that have the meteor icon designating them. I can't really say I'm a huge fan of Endwalker's story for a slew of reasons, not least of all being the completely flat delivery and cop-out of a long-time villain being sidelined, but it's still fun to see the main characters. At least that's what I would say if it wasn't just repeating their character arcs from the previous expansion. Final Fantasy XIV also has some really strong side characters, and when used properly and in the right amounts, it's really neat to see them grow and face the challenges presented to them. It works well to serve as a mouthpiece too, since our character is a largely silent protagonist who answers in nods and scowls, aside from the very seldom response choice that doesn't matter in the slightest in the long run. Unfortunately, these characters are also run very dry by now, as we've stopped being introduced to new ones and have spent the last 2 or 3 expansions watching the same few characters react the same few ways. I feel especially bad for Graha here, since he's been demoted from aspiring adventurer with an interesting backstory to mostly being a resident Warrior of Light fanboy. I should hold my tongue a moment, though, as when we finish the base story of Endwalker, we do get to experience another story revolving around the long-time mystery of the Void, which we know to be the 13th Shard. Hope you weren't expecting much of a story with it, though, as they basically just rehash the Final Fantasy IV story and throw in a few of their own twists with it. I'm sure it's a genuinely fun story to newcomers to the series, or even someone who just hasn't played all of the old games to death like I have, but it's definitely a letdown to see a poorly rehashed version of an old gem with the add-in of a character that I really couldn't care less about. Zero is just a boring character to me. Maybe that changes in the later quests, but I started zoning out hard on the story by the time it was all wrapping up, and there was just no saving it for me. So the main story is a miss for me, but there is other story-related content in the overworld to look at. There are tons of generic side quests in each zone that will elaborate on some of the local lore and the story unfolding, and these can be genuinely pretty interesting from a narrative perspective. To be fair, I also can't think of an MMO I've ever played where the actual objectives of quests are ever all that riveting, so it's not like I can rate these too poorly on the content scale either. I'd call them a fun distraction when you're tired of pushing through the main story, or a great bit of filler if you're waiting for a DPS queue and don't want to sit around or tab out. There's also a large set of side quests that will be marked with a blue background and a plus on them, denoting that they unlock something for you. This could be a dungeon, a raid, or sometimes something even more involved like the tribal quest that we'll get to talk about in the future. So these are generally worth doing as they have more content gated behind them. In terms of quests, how does WoW stack up? About the same, truthfully. It doesn't seem to tear its quests from another game as far as I can tell, but it's really not that much more interesting. You get to learn about the people who inhabit this newly accessible continent and help them with their local troubles before all banding together to take down the new threat looming over the world. The thing I do tend to appreciate about WoW's story over 14's is that I just feel much more involved. 14 relies heavily on the Chosen One trope, whereas WoW I'm kind of just a well-seasoned hero that my chosen faction can rely on when the going gets tough. The world doesn't seem to revolve around me in this game, and things get done without my input or approval. Makes the world feel that much more cohesive. The story itself is pretty generic, with a few interesting beats and a massively cliché ending, but like 14, a lot of the meat lies on what you can do on the side. Many of the side adventures are pretty interesting and continue long-standing storylines. That's another neat thing about WoW that I appreciate a lot. Storylines aren't really self-contained. They'll intertwine with other stories and continue over the course of several expansions. Of course, this isn't always a hit, and it can definitely be grating to spend years waiting for a conclusion to a storyline that's less than stellar. I don't have nearly as much history or stake with the story of WoW as I do with Final Fantasy XIV, so I probably don't judge it nearly as harshly. However, I will say that I overall found the Dragonflight story to be lackluster and probably not worth repeating once you do it the first time for the provided goodies. That being said, you don't have to do it multiple times despite the aforementioned class lock. If you complete it on a single character, not too daunting of a task, future characters will have access to what they call Adventure Mode. Adventure Mode allows future characters to enjoy all the benefits of the new expansion without having to trudge through the story again. Very handy. If the stories are mediocre though, what's left in these overworlds to do? Quite a bit, actually. Let's take a look at each game's take on world quests next. Final Fantasy XIV has these things called full active time events, or just fates if you prefer. Fates generally involve killing a specific number of enemies, a boss, guarding an NPC or a set of items from waves of enemies, or gathering a specific number of items off the ground or from killing enemies. Lots of enemy slaughter, which would be fine if they lived longer than 10 seconds. Fates in and of themselves are somewhat dull and repetitive, but they serve a similar purpose to side quests and help break up the monotony of the main quest and long queues. Each zone also has a rank based off of fates completed, requiring 10 for the second tier and 60 more for the final one. Each tier unlocks more items for you to purchase along the way, and to purchase these goodies you need bicolored gemstones which are rewarded on each fate completion, thus creating a nice self-contained loop. The things you can buy are generally pretty useful, as it's a great source of crafting materials that are otherwise annoying to grind out. On top of that, you can also nab some riding maps to make you faster on the ground, or even pets and orchestrion rolls to help you satisfy that collector nagging you deep in your heart. There are also more rare fates that spawn in each zone, generally as part of a chain of fates and culminate in a much more dangerous and long-lasting boss. These often result in larger rewards such as fashion accessories, triple triad cards, and the biggest baddies will give out tokens that you can trade in for more outfits and mounts. On the other side of things, we have WoW and its world quests. These are quite a bit more varied than Fates. There are plenty of the same old kill enough enemies to satisfy the agent, or gather up this item from the enemy quests, but we also have things like this food fight with the dragons of Algathar Academy, or fishing up some food for the Tuskar. Just because these are different though, doesn't really make them much more entertaining or fun than the average kill quest, but there is another set of quests that do feel different enough to be fun. These are the world quests that deal with the expansion gimmick of dragon riding. There are a few of these that don't stand out, that just require you to fly through a handful of objects in the sky, but there are also the dragon riding races. These require you to just fly through a small course of rings and manage your vigor to do so as fast as possible. They're not groundbreaking by any means, but it's nice to see the expansion gimmick worked into one of the major facets of the games. Rewards from WoW's world quests are also generally a step above Fate rewards, seeing as you get a decent amount of pocket change, resources used around the Dragon Isles, and for newer characters you can even get some decent pieces of loot that'll get your foot in the door for later content. This wraps me into the main issue with overworld questing nowadays compared to what it used to be. Traversal is so easy that the journey is basically non-existent. Here's a side-by-side of me walking across Valdrakken by foot and me riding across the entirety of the Onaran Plains. And here's me walking through Sharlayan versus me flying across Ultimate Duel. The appeal of questing was never really the objectives, it was about getting to the objectives. And nowadays we can just get where we need in the blink of an eye via teleportation and fast mount travel. But that's just for questing. There's still quite a bit of content happening outside of that. Next up, we'll take a look at each game's take on reputation. Final Fantasy XIV's take on rep revolves entirely around daily quests called tribal quests. In Endwalker, these are unlocked via small quest chains, and each of the three revolves around one of the three types of classes. There's the Arkasodara for Disciples of War or Magic, the Omicron for the Disciples of the Land, and the Loporrits for the Disciples of the Hand, that is, battle, gathering, and crafting classes respectively. Each day, a player is allocated 12 tribal quest allowances, but that's not really relevant since each group will only allow you to do 3 a day unless you rank up with them, in which case you're allowed a second set. Each quest will give you a bit of reputation, and when you reach the threshold, you can do their next story quest to advance to the next rank. Each rank up unlocks new quests, as well as new items you can purchase from them with the tokens you receive from each quest. The quests are nothing special, generally a mixture of talking to the right NPC, using the right emote on an NPC, or performing duties related to whichever set of classes pertain to the related tribe. The rewards are where things start to look up, as each tribe has a related minion and mount to purchase, as well as a slew of helpful endgame bits and bobs, such as crafting materials and materia, to keep you kitted for the stuff to come later on this list. World of Warcraft has a different take on this. It always has. Reputation grinding has been a long-standing part of WoW that's deeply entwined with the main game rather than a piece of side content. In this expansion, we have 6 factions in the Dragonscale Expedition, the Maruk Centaur, the Iskara Tuskar, the Valdrakken Accord, the Loam Niffin, and the Dream Wardens. Each of these factions are closely related to one of the zones, but you can earn reputation for anyone just about anywhere through the right quests. You can earn reputation through many lanes in the Dragon Isles. World quests offer a fair bit of it, regular quests will generally give you some, and you can collect turn-in items from many sources to help keep you climbing the ranks. Each rank with each faction will offer varied rewards. Sometimes it's little gear upgrades, sometimes it's upgrade items, and as you get higher and higher in the ranks, you'll even unlock dragon customization options and even other mounts entirely. On top of this, you'll unlock a mini-world event for each of these factions that you can do weekly for large rewards, as well as repeat throughout the week for some more minor rewards and reputation boosts. These are longer-form events that include a variety of steps that feel like strung-together world quests. We have the Siege on Dragonbane Keep, the Grand Hunt, the Community Feast, which is hands down the best one, Researchers Under Fire, and the Super Blooms, to name the ones directly related to the major factions. These are generally pretty fun to catch since they feel less like a minor distraction and more like something you're actually intended to set aside some time to do. They don't really overstay their welcome as main content and can still serve their purpose as filler while waiting for a queue. Blizzard does a pretty good job with world events, I'm a fan. We're still not done with overworlds though, as next up we have the staple of the big old creeps that we all get together to beat back into whatever cave they wandered out of. World bosses. They come in different names, shape, and sizes across both games, but they each have them in abundance. In Final Fantasy XIV, it actually doesn't start with world bosses, or ranked hunt marks in this game. It actually starts with normal enemies smattered about the world. Each day you can pick up 3 stacks of bills, junior, associate, and senior hunts. Each of these require you to travel through the 6 zones and kill 1 to 3 enemies of each of the 5 enemies found within the stacks of bills. These can sometimes overlap, making it slightly faster, but you still get 15 different rewards of gil, EXP if you aren't max level, and 3, 4, or 15 sacks of nuts that can be traded in for materia, catch-up gear, gear upgrade materials, and even a mount if you save up enough. Moving up on the list, we next have elite hunts, or B-rank hunts as they're known colloquially. There's one of these in each zone, and the respawn timer is only about 5 seconds, but you can't get the reward more than once a week. The elite hunt bill you get will determine which one you need to find and take out, and it will give a fair bit more rewards than the little marks. We've still got more to go though. Next up we have A-rank hunts, 12 total. Each zone has 2 specific ones that spawn on a 4 to 6 hour timer. These are the most activity you'll really see in the overworld generally, as the community will all gather up for what they call a train and will barrel from mark to mark to take them down. It's a neat little event and is one of the fastest ways to cap on the weekly tomes for current gear. It also provides a large amount of nuts and clusters for materia. Above A ranks, we have S ranks. These are full-on raid-style bosses that can spawn every 84 to 132 hours, but they don't just spawn naturally. They each have specific spawn conditions that must be met after their window opens. So, to clarify, every 3.5 to 5.5 days, these guys can be spawned by meeting specific conditions within their respective zones. These spawn conditions are as follows. For Burfler, use a tiny troll minion on one of his spawn points during the clear or fair skies weather during the daytime. For Spatica, kill 100 Vajralangula, 100 Pisaka, and 100 Esvata. For Armstrong, a player must be wearing the Mended Imperial Pot Helm and the Mended Imperial Short Robe and die on one of his spawn points. For Ruminator, kill 100 Thinkers, 100 Weepers, and 100 Wanderers. For Ophioneus, discard a stack of 5 Eggs of Elpis. For Narrow Rift, have 10 people with the Wee Aya minion travel over a spawn point. With the longer timers, specific conditions, and massively inflated health pools, these guys have the best rewards yet. I should point out that A and S ranks actually have a reward merit system. Based on your contribution to the fight, you'll receive a tier of rewards. Fates also work off of this system now that I'm thinking about it. It prevents someone from just showing up and leeching off all the work done at the end, kind of. With all that said about hunts in 14, we still aren't done. No, we need to talk about the ever-elusive SS rank Cur. Cur will spawn whenever its minions are defeated. Well, how do we do that? Easy. They have a chance of spawning anytime an S rank is defeated. 4 of them will spawn scattered across the current zone, and if they're all defeated within 5 minutes, Cur will spawn. As the biggest and baddest of the hunt marks, Cur offers the most rewards for players that manage to take it down. I think it a bit of a missed opportunity that Cur doesn't have any specific rewards to itself though. It's just beefed up reward numbers on the things that every other hunt already offers. It would be cool to see it have a rare drop of maybe a minion of itself, or a mount if they're feeling particularly spicy. On the other side of the pond, we have world bosses and rare spawns. World bosses are big, open-world raid bosses that require a fair amount of people to effectively kill. There are 6 of them as of the time of writing this script, but only one of them is particularly useful for killing outside of an associated world quest. In the interest of suspense, and since we did it this way in 14, let's work our way from the bottom to the top. In the Waking Shores, we have Basrakron, the Shale Wink. In the Onaran Plains, we have Stunran, the Sky's Misery. In the Azure Span, we've got Bazwal, the Dreaded Flame. And in Thaldraszus, we have Liskanoth, the Future Bane. These aren't the only ones, obviously. I mentioned there being 6 like 10 seconds ago, but these are the only 4 that the expansion launched with, since Zarelek Caverns and the Emerald Dream came in later patches. These 4 rotate which one is available each week and drop similar item level loot. These guys are pretty cool thematically to me, as each one is directly related to one of the main antagonists, that is the Incarnates, through the element they represent. Basrakron and Iridikron are Earth, Stunran and Razageth are Storm, which is a weird element, but it is what it is. Bazwal and Farak are Fire, and Liskanoth and Viranoth are Ice. Is this an obvious and surface level connection? Yes. Yes, it is. I still think it's cool. Once we got Zarelek Caverns, we got access to the Zakali Elders, a fight against a duo of these fire and shadow wielding brutes. This is the first time we're really looking at it, but World of Warcraft is a lot of these fights where you'll be fighting 2 or more bosses at the same time. It's really cool, and I wish 14 did this more often because it lets AoE-oriented classes shine in a raid setting. These guys will drop slightly better loot than the 4 dragons roaming around topside, but it's still not really worth doing outside of the world quests nowadays. The world boss worth actually killing nowadays is this beefy lad, Orastor the Hibernator. He can be found in the Emerald Dream, wandering around all cranky-like because the ongoing war against the Incarnates woke him up. When defeated, he can drop some pretty decent gear for the current season, as well as a transformation for druids to deck out their bear form all fancy-like. If these don't tickle your content itch enough, well, don't worry. Across the entirety of the Dragon Isles, in all 7 zones, there are a myriad of rare spawns cycling through the world. Each of these can be looted once a day for their own individual loot, as well as gold and resources. The ones in the Emerald Dream each also have a corresponding world event before they spawn, allowing players time to group up before they do, and to help spawn them faster by working out whatever is going on. These are kind of similar to the S ranks in 14, with some of them requiring you to kill enemies, set up a picnic, or even dredge the beast from the depths of the water. I really like the system, since it helps to make sure you don't miss the spawn if you happen to be on the other side of the zone when it started. There's another bit of good news in that the stuff on the top side hasn't been totally invalidated with content updates and gear power creep. There's an event called the Dream Surge that will empower the rare spawns in a given zone periodically and cause them to drop better gear, as well as some currency for similarly leveled gear to help a character get started with the current patch of content, or for pets and mounts if you don't need the gear. All in all, there's a lot of overworld bosses in each game to track down, and they'll all be dying pretty quick with little to no issues. The main idea between the 2 of them is just how often you can kill and loot these bosses, as well as the drops you actually get from them. So, we're mostly done with the overworlds then, but let's wrap up the last few loose ends. Each game actually has a little bit of content that isn't really super comparable between them. For instance, Final Fantasy XIV has treasure maps that have you gather up a small party, track down a chest in the overworld, and when you clear out the enemies that spawn, you'll get a little loot as well as a chance to be sent to a dungeon with even more loot. Thinking about it now, I think I have seen treasure maps in Dragonflight, but I'm not really sure how they work in comparison. Either way, I think these maps and dungeons are a really fun distraction to keep you busy between bigger content, and it's a great way to spend some time with some friends. For WoW earlier, I mentioned dragon riding races, and these were really a fun distraction for me. Each race has several different difficulties and reverse races, and getting gold on all of these was a lot of fun to fish for. You don't really get any useful rewards for it, just some titles and a toy, but the races themselves were fun to learn and go through. WoW also has the massive overworld events I touched on earlier. These are something that I would actually like to see in 14, as it's really fun to see a lot of players flock together to get the task completed for better rewards. The community feast in particular is really fun to goof around in when it pops up. Helping my man Big Kinook over here make some tasty soup never gets old. Both games' overworlds actually ended up having quite a bit of merit, but for me, I think WoW takes it in the end. I feel much more involved in it than I ever really have in 14's. There's a lot going on in it to keep you drawn in and moving from content to content rather than just repeating the same couple of tasks over and over again. At the very least, it masks it better. That being said, both of them could use a bit of work to make them completely sustainable. I'm not the guy to tell them how to do that, but I do feel like repeating my thought that the overworld isn't much more than an afterthought to fill in after the meaningful content is put in. So, let's go ahead and take a look at said meaningful content. Dungeons are the meat of both games. It's likely where you'll spend a lot of your time, both leveling and at the end, as they help you get currency for gear in 14 and never really fall out of relevancy in WoW. Are they fun, though? Well, let's break it down. Final Fantasy XIV has a total of 13 dungeons in Endwalker. Of these, 11 are mandatory to the story, and the other 2 are side content easily unlocked when you finish the main story at level 90. Each of these dungeons follow the same formula of a linear path of small trash mobs into a boss, with 3 bosses total. The dungeons this expansion flip-flop between how difficult they are at a base. Some of them require a fair bit more attention than the others, but very rarely do dungeons require much more than basic competency from a player. I can only assume that this is due to dungeons being story requirements and Square not wanting to gate any players from the story due to a skill level. It's a shame too. A lot of these dungeons have some pretty cool base concepts for mechanics, but it's hard to really get invested in them when there's next to no punishment for failing them. A decently geared non-tank can generally survive a handful of vulnerability stacks before they even approach being in danger. There is a secondary form of dungeons via variant and criterion dungeons. The variant dungeon is a multi-path dungeon with each path culminating in either a new boss or at the very least an altered version of one of the others. These are designed to be done with as few as one player, and that's facilitated through variant actions, which give you off-roll actions such as a heal and a provoke as a DPS, a shield and a mitigation as a healer, or a big old dot for tanks. Once you clear the variant dungeon, you can access the criterion dungeon, which is a much harder version that will put your team of 4 to the test. These are pretty interesting. I've poked around in them in a bit, but I don't have friends that enjoy hard content enough to want to do them, and I refuse to pug them. They have some fun cosmetic rewards like mounts to show off that you got through them though, and I can appreciate that. I like these. Keep them coming, Square. And that's really it for 14 dungeons. And normal dungeons, as long as you don't fall asleep at the wheel, you'll have no issues, and if you're playing a tank, you kind of have to try to die in any level of decent gear. Tanks have so much self-sustain nowadays, unless you play one of these. If you do, I'm so sorry for your loss. Criterion is a nice side goal for a group who doesn't have much else going on and just wants to shit it up in some content, but it would be nice to see some middle ground. On the WoW side of things, well, it doesn't fare much better to start off. I do like the design philosophy of WoW dungeons more out of the gate, as they aren't usually completely linear paths and will allow you some choice in what trash you fight, and occasionally even have skippable bosses to go with the trash. Unfortunately, dungeons are even faster and easier than in 14. In these 9 dungeons, trash will generally fall over to anything more than a light breeze, and bosses are dead before they even finish their beginning monologue. It would be pretty damning for WoW if it weren't for a lovely mechanic called dungeon difficulty. See, when normal dungeons are nothing more than wheat before the scythe, you can move on to heroics. These dungeons beef up the HP and damage on all enemies and add in new mechanics to juggle. They're still pretty mediocre though. Heroics have more HP and damage, sure, but once you have even the slightest level of gear, you'll tear through these as if they were normals. But wait! There's more. The real meat and potatoes of WoW dungeons are mythics, specifically Mythic Plus. Mythic Plus is such a cool system that I really want to see 14 incorporate in some way, shape, or form. Upon clearing a standard mythic, you'll receive a keystone with an attached number starting at 2. Whatever dungeon this is for will have a couple of affixes that change up the mechanics of the game, from increased trash or boss health and damage to some minor annoyances that will move you around, all the way up to ghosts that if they grab you, they stuff you into an animatronic suit. What? At 2, you just have one affix, and it'll be the most simple ones, but once you reach 7, they'll add in a second one. Once you've clawed your way all the way up to 14s, you'll have to deal with 3 affixes, and I would tell you about how hard it is, but I'm a little baby, and as of writing this script, haven't gone above a 9. Update: I have attained Keystone Master, and the 3rd affixes are not that bad. On top of all of that, the dungeons in the Mythic Plus pool actually change every once in a while, in tune with the seasons of the game, so that they don't get stale over the course of an entire expansion. In fact, the current rotation barely has any Dragonflight dungeons in it as we're on the 3rd season. Blizzard has taken several old dungeons and tuned them up for this expansion's Mythics, which is a great way to keep old content relevant in new patches. Great work! Mythic Plus dungeons blow any other form of dungeon out of the water, and it isn't even close. Any MMO really needs a way to keep dungeons not only relevant in the endgame, but also engaging. Criterion dungeons come pretty close to this, but they don't have the affixes, they don't have stacking difficulties, and they aren't even relevant to gearing your character in the slightest. As far as dungeons go, it's WoW, all the way. 14 has the base philosophy down, it just needs a bit more dedication to keeping dungeons fun and engaging for more than just a couple of runs. I think if they managed to implement a decent iteration of the Mythic Plus system, they could easily stand toe-to-toe with WoW dungeons, though. There's one more bit of endgame to talk about now, so let's go over those big bad bosses, the raids. This is probably where we're going to see the most differences between the two games, as each of them have a very different philosophy when it comes to big fight design. Final Fantasy XIV relies more on solving the puzzles the fight presents to you with a relatively low to middling requirement for execution. There are, of course, exceptions to this, but we'll get there when we get there. First and foremost, we don't actually even start with raids, but rather trials. Trials are a single boss fight that doubles the party from the 4-player composition, a light party, to an 8-player composition, a full party. Trials come in a couple of flavors: normal, extreme, and unreal. Each of these offer a different level of difficulty, kind of. Extreme and unreal are basically the same, except unreal trials are old trials that get scaled up to the new expansion on a patch rotation for newer players to experience them without gimping their skill set. Normal trials are pretty simple, but they do offer more challenge than dungeons, thankfully. There will be a single boss, at least in the 7 Endwalker trials, and it'll throw mechanics at you back to back till one of you dies. These mechanics are usually well spaced and give you plenty of time to catch your breath and recover between them if you find yourself panicking. Each of the trials this expansion are honestly pretty decent. I had a lot of fun with each of them through my first time, and even more fun learning the extremes with my friends. The fight designs for trials are genuinely a step up from Shadowbringers. The extremes are also a lot of fun and offer a pretty reasonable step up in challenge. Extremes are where I would generally recommend a player go to begin learning high-end content in 14, so it's nice to see that there's a genuinely good balance this expansion of difficult mechanics that demand your attention, but enough breathing room for new players to digest what just happened without having to go back to the start immediately. Extremes also introduce a new concept to fights, enrages. If you've played MMOs for any amount of time, you probably know what this is, but for the sake of runtime, an enrage is when you've been fighting a boss for too long and it remembers that it is, in fact, just better than you. So it hits you with a massive skill difference and tells you to get bent and instantly kills you and your entire party. This requires you and your party to actually get good at the fight, at least good enough to kill it before it wants to go back to bed. Each extreme trial also has a small chance at dropping a mount themed around the boss. This expansion, their links is color-coded to the bosses, and there's a super secret super mount that you can get for collecting them all. It's not actually a secret though. Square told us that it was just Final Fantasy IV Bahamut a while ago, which brings me to my only real issue with the trials this expansion. Of the 7 of them, 4 of them are bosses pulled from an old game. This is nothing new, as we've had many enemies ported over from old games into the mold of 14, but Endwalker has felt particularly lazy and haphazard about its usage of assets from Final Fantasy What's that? I already complained about this? Yeah, okay, got it. Unreal Trials, as I mentioned earlier, are old extreme trials taken from their original release and souped up for level 90 players. I actually really like these, as they don't get outgeared for easy clears like most extreme trials do, even on level. They require you to actually know the fight or get filtered, and that's pretty based. I mentioned with dungeons that Blizzard cycles old dungeons in for mythics, so seeing that done for trials in this game is equally as cool. It's, as I said earlier, a phenomenal way to preserve old content. Sticking with 8-player content, we next have normal raids. These were, once upon a time, a small wing with some trash to fight your way through to handle a bigger, beefier guy. No longer though, as they're basically just slightly harder trials with their own storyline. This expansion, we got to experience Pandemonium, a super jail for super monsters kept in super hell, basically. There's a lot of parental trauma and marital strife going on. I don't know. I just want to hunt megafauna with the homies. In Pandemonium, there are 3 tiers, each with 4 bosses. Asphodelos for 1 through 4, Abyssos for 5 through 8, and Anabaseos for 9 through 12. Each boss gates the next on initial clears within their tier, and each boss has its own loot for you to roll on when you beat it for the first time weekly within its time as the current tier. When the locks come off though, you can go loot goblin as much as you want for glamour options. Each of these tiers is alright. As I mentioned, these are basically Trials 1.5. They're slightly harder and slightly more unforgiving, but still designed so that your average player can get through them with relative ease. For a lot of players, this is endgame. They'll come to do their weekly normal clears, get their tokens, and go back to rattling around in the main cities doing whatever they want. But some people want more, and for them, might I offer Savage Raids? Savage Raids are to normal raids what Extreme Trials wish they could be for normal trials. These are much harder versions of the normal raids that require a good bit more teamwork, skill, and damage. The bosses will have new mechanics, reworked old mechanics, and sometimes even entirely new phases added for you to deal with. Savage Raids are where you really start to experience 14's endgame and design philosophy in full swing. This is where raids become those aforementioned puzzles. The boss is going to slap you with a bunch of seemingly random shit and tell you to figure it out. These mechanics often aren't actually hard to execute, but do require you to know what's going on and to be able to quickly and effectively handle your end of it. This is definitely hectic at first, but with a little time and experience, you'll likely realize that these fights are on rails and have very preset sets of mechanics that require you less to solve the whole puzzle, and more just figure out where this piece goes. It's a nice learning curve, and you'll definitely begin to understand things quicker, as many mechanics are just older ones with a new coat of paint. The good news is, if you hate fun and don't actually want to figure the puzzle out for yourself, there's a million guides per fight out there for you to look up and easily push your way through one. Savage Raids will offer players their best possible gear, as well as a mount dropping from the final boss each time it's killed for the first time within its lock, or every time after the lock falls off. The loot system is one of the cruxes of both games that kind of bothers me, but we'll talk about that another day. So, let's say you've done your normals for the week, but Savage isn't really your thing, but you still want to raid and get loot, and you want to do it with more people. I would say you have a very specific set of desires, but we have a very specific answer for you in Alliance Raids. These are 24 player instances that will have you fighting your way through several packs of trash and 4 or so bosses. They're about as difficult as a normal raid, mechanically speaking, but seeing as it relies on 3 times as many people to be playing at any level of proficiency, these definitely can feel harder than they need to. The theme of this expansion was Myths of the Realm, which throughout the raids of Aglaia, Euphrosyne, and Thalea, saw the players fighting the 12 gods of the realm as well as their super fused form at the very end to set them free from the world or something. I think they stuck around, but not actually. I don't know. I didn't care for the story and stopped paying attention after Aglaia. The raids themselves are kind of mid, too. Aglaia was the most interesting overall, with only a couple standout bosses between Euphrosyne and Thalea. Alliance raids give what I think the community calls catch-up gear. It's 10 item levels below the best in slot, and generally the relevant Alliance raid will come out a patch or so after the normal raid of the same tier. But, let's say, and yet another hypothetical scenario, you don't need to catch up. You've been on top of things since day 1. You've cleared all the savages and have all of your best in slot gear. You've done all of your weekly goodies to start gearing a second class, got all of your mounts from extremes, think everything is easy and for babies and you want a challenge. Now what? You do anything but play more Final Fantasy XIV for your own sanity, you clown. Or you do Ultimate Raids. Ultimate Raids will take us back down to 8-player content and will offer the hardest content in the game aside from that one meme about getting a house or whatever. Ultimate Raids will put every player in them to the test as they are much longer than your average fight with much more demanding mechanics that will push you to your very What is it now? What? They've cleared ultimates with no healer? That can't be right. It's meant to be hard. That would mean like healing it's... Okay, I won't start right now. Where was I? Oh, yeah. Ultimates will push you to your very limit. Memes aside, the people who've cleared this stuff with off composition are incredible players who've probably dedicated a lot of time to learning the fights normally before pushing into doing it goofy ways. I've put in a bit of time into these myself and gotten past at least the first phase of each of them, and even that took a couple of hours per raid on average. These are a lot of fun because while they do still operate on rails, there's generally enough variance that you still have to be paying attention to handle things properly. My only gripe is that all of my friends do hate fun and won't do them with me, and doing these in Party Finder is like pulling teeth with dynamite. On the other side of the road, things are much more simple. In Dragonflight, we have 3 raids with 4 difficulties: Vault of the Incarnates, Aberrus, the Shadowed Crucible, and Amirdrasil, the Dream's Hope, each on Looking for Raid, LFR, Normal, Heroic, and Mythic. Much like 14, only the most recent one, Amirdrasil in this case, is really relevant and offers current gear as loot. LFR is the only difficulty you can get into via the Duty Finder, and with 25 players is much easier than the other 3. Normal is, well, normal, and will require you to form a party of, generally, around 20 players, then travel to the raid to enter. Heroic beefs up the raid quite a bit and introduces new mechanics, and Mythic to an even higher degree. I don't have experience with Mythic, but it definitely seems to be just as difficult as some of the ultimate raids in 14. Heroic also eludes me, but it looks like a really fun elevated difficulty from what I have seen. LFR and normals are easy, though with it relying on 20 plus people, it can often go downhill pretty quickly if 2 or 3 of those people aren't paying enough attention. One other thing I do really like about raids in WoW is that they're generally the culmination of the current arc of the story. Amirdrasil is basically the end of what's been going on in the Dream and with Farok, so poising it as the final challenge for players to conquer in the story is super nifty. Massive style points for that, rather than having it be side content. Well, with all the major content in mind, which game should you choose in the end? The answer should be pretty obvious. Final Fantasy XI, of course. Jokes aside, I wanted to throw a bit of talk about this game in here as a bit of a control between the other two. It's obviously an MMO just like the other two, but unlike them, it hasn't been massively modernized. I know classic WoW is a thing now too, but I don't have any experience with that and don't feel like putting much time into it immediately to use as a benchmark, so shut up and let me talk about this game. Final Fantasy XI doesn't have a lot of the things that WoW and 14 do. It doesn't have the global cooldown for abilities or even hotbar skills. It doesn't have all the fast travel and flying mounts. It doesn't even have a dungeon finder or raid finder. If you want to do content with people, you have to talk to them, or use the failsafe of trusts, which are just NPC party members to help you out since the game isn't nearly as big as it once was. 14 and WoW are, nowadays, designed in a way so that you don't have to spend too much time to experience the basics of the game, while still offering an endgame for people who do want to dedicate more time to the game. 11 has no respect for your time. Rather, it expects you to want to experience the game rather than be rushed through it for endgame content. It also seems to, funnily enough, have the best community around it. MMO players are pretty cliquey and will stick within their friend groups a lot of the time, and honestly, the general attitude towards other players in both 14 and WoW is either dismissive or hostile in a lot of cases. So I was genuinely surprised while playing 11 to see longtime veterans trying to help me out and set me on the right path. Crazy what happens when people are there for a game they enjoy rather than their Stockholm Syndrome and weekly rewards. So in all seriousness, if you're looking for a modern MMO to play, which one is best? That depends on you. Each game offers a profoundly different endgame experience and fluctuates on how good that experience even is. High-end content is almost always in contention by the people who play it, myself included. Sometimes you absolutely love the current raids. Sometimes they suck and are boring. Sometimes they're barely a raid at all. Eric Tonios. If you aren't looking for hard endgame content and want to do simple weekly stuff, then that also falls into a decision of what kind of weeklies do you prefer. Do you want the weekly currency system of 14 or the loot of WoW? Do you prefer smaller instances with a few friends, or do you want to punch the shit out of a demigod with 24 other people? Both games offer both, but the focus is different. You might not even want to do content at the end and might just want to get transmog gear and RP, you weirdo. RP in my RPG? If that's the case, though, it comes down to aesthetic, which is another valid reason to pick one over the other. I know people that refuse to play WoW because of the aesthetic, and, maybe the company it's tied to. Maybe you want to be a crafter or gatherer at the end game, which means we'd need to look at those systems in both games, and I don't want to do that in this video because I don't like them in either game. But there are major differences in how they work, let alone how you can't even do them all in a single character in WoW. It's easy to flip-flop between the games depending on how you feel about them at the moment, assuming you have them both. At the end of the day, the goal is having fun, So remember that the next time you flame a tank for not being the world's top tank at level 12. Take care in whichever game you choose, and I'll see you whenever I finish the Final Fantasy IV video, or whatever side project I decide takes precedence.